Here's something that might surprise you about Jesse Pinkman. He is not the good guy. I know, heresy. Every Reddit thread, every YouTube comment section, every pub conversation about Breaking Bad eventually lands on the same conclusion. Walter White is the villain, and Jesse is the victim. The innocent kid dragged into this hell by his monstrous chemistry teacher. And look, there's some truth in that. Walter White is a deeply dangerous human being, and we covered exactly why in a previous episode. But reducing Jesse to the good one, this is what makes him one of the most psychologically fascinating characters ever written for television. Because Jesse Pinkman's tragedy isn't that bad things happen to him. His tragedy is that he is psychologically engineered by his upbringing, by his attachment wounds, by the very architecture of his personality, to seek out the people and situations that confirm the one belief he carries everywhere he goes, that he is worthless. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Not in Jesse, and honestly, probably not in a few people you know either. So, let's break this down. For anyone who somehow hasn't watched Breaking Bad, first of all, what have you been doing? Well, here's the quick version anyway. Jesse Pinkman is a small-time methamphetamine cook and dealer in Albuquerque, New Mexico. When we meet him, he's living in a rundown house, cooking low-grade products, calling himself Cap'n Cook, and generally failing at the one career path he's chosen for himself. He is, by most external measures, a mess. Then his former high school chemistry teacher, Walter White, blackmails him into a partnership, and over 5 seasons, we watch Jesse get pulled deeper and deeper into a world of escalating violence, moral compromise, and psychological devastation. But here's what matters for us. Jesse isn't just a passenger in this story. He makes choices. He stays when he could have left. He trusts when every rational signal says, do not do that. He attaches himself to people who hurt him, and he pushes away people who might not. The question isn't, why do bad things happen to Jesse Pinkman? The question is, why does Jesse Pinkman keep walking towards them? And the answers live in 2 places: his personality structure and his attachment wounds. So, let's start with personality.
I accept who I am.
And who are you?
I'm the bad guy.
Right, the big 5. 5 broad dimensions of personality that between them capture most of the meaningful variations in how humans think, feel, and behave. We use them on this channel because they're the most empirically robust personality framework we've got. Not because they explain everything, but because they explain a lot. So let's walk through Jesse. Openness to experience, moderate to high. Openness captures how curious, creative, and emotionally receptive someone is. High scorers tend towards imagination, aesthetic sensitivity, and a willingness to engage with new ideas. Low scorers prefer the familiar, the concrete, the practical. Jesse sits somewhere moderate to high here, and it shows up in places people don't always notice. He's an artist, literally. He takes a community college art class and produces a wooden box so beautiful his teacher is genuinely moved. He talks about it later with real pride. It's one of the few moments in the entire series where Jesse connects with something that isn't destructive, and that matters. He's also emotionally porous in a way that high openness people often are. He doesn't just observe suffering, he absorbs it. The child neglect cases, the boy on the dirt bike, Brock's poisoning, these don't just upset Jesse, they shatter him. He metabolizes other people's pain as if it were his own. Now this is a double-edged quality. That emotional receptiveness is part of what makes Jesse capable of empathy that Walter White will never access. But it also means Jesse has almost no psychological armor. Everything lands, everything penetrates, and in the world he's operating in, that is catastrophic. You know that person who cries at adverts, who can't watch the news without carrying it for days, who feels the room's emotional temperature the moment they walk in. That's high openness in its emotional dimension. It makes you deeply human. It also makes you deeply vulnerable. Conscientiousness is low. This one's fairly straightforward, and is where Jesse's surface level dysfunction lives. Conscientiousness measures discipline, organization, planning, ability to follow through. Low scorers are impulsive, disorganized, and tend to live reactively rather than strategically. Jesse is remarkably low here. He can't maintain a plan, he can't sustain a routine unless someone else imposes it upon him. His house is a wreck, his finances are chaotic, his decision making is almost entirely emotional and immediate. But, and this is important, low conscientiousness isn't the same as stupidity. Jesse is frequently underestimated, including by Walter White, and that's a mistake. Jesse has genuine street intelligence, creative problem-solving ability, and occasional flashes of strategic thinking. The magnet scheme? That's Jesse, thinking laterally when everyone else is stuck. The issue isn't capability, it's sustained effort. Jesse can rise to a moment, but he can't build a structure. And that matters because it means he almost always depends on someone else to provide the framework that his life operates within. His parents, Walter, Gus, Jack's gang. Jesse slots into other people's systems because he can't build his own. You've met this person, bright, creative, capable of brilliant moments, but their life looks chaotic because they can't do the boring bits, can't do the maintenance, and because of that they end up relying on people who can, which creates a power imbalance that doesn't always go very well. Extroversion, moderate but with a performance layer. Now this one is interesting because Jesse presents as more extroverted than he actually is. The yo bitch Jesse, the bravado, the slang, the crew, the parties, that's a persona. It's a social costume that Jesse wears because he learned early that vulnerability gets punished. The real Jesse is the one sitting alone in an empty house, staring at the wall. The one who sits quietly with Brock watching television. The one who breaks down in therapy in El Camino. Genuine extroversion is about where you draw energy from. True extroverts are energized by social interactions. Jesse is drained by it. He uses it as anesthetic. The parties aren't connection, they're noise. They're a way of not being alone with his own thoughts without actually being present with anyone else. This is moderate extroversion at best, masked by a high-energy social performance. And it's a pattern you see in people who learned that being seen as fun and loud is safer than being seen as vulnerable and quiet. It's the class clown dynamic. Everyone's laughing, nobody's looking too closely. And that's the point. His agreeableness is high, and dangerously so. And this is the big one. This is where Jesse's psychology gets genuinely heartbreaking. Agreeableness measures warmth, compassion, cooperativeness, and the tendency to prioritize others' needs over your own. High agreeableness sounds lovely on paper, but in practice, when it's combined with low self-worth and insecure attachment, which we'll get to, it becomes a vulnerability that other people can exploit ruthlessly. Jesse is profoundly agreeable. He cares about children with a ferocity that borders on parental. He cannot stomach cruelty. He feels guilt so intensely that it manifests as physical breakdown, the insomnia, the weight loss, the drug use escalating every time someone dies. And critically, he's a people pleaser. Not in the mild, sure I'll help you move house sense, in the deep structural sense where Jesse's entire self-concept is dependent on someone else's approval. Watch how he responds to Walter White's praise. When Walter says, "You're better than this," or shows any paternal warmth, Jesse lights up. It's not subtle. It's a starving person being offered food. And watch how he responds to Walter's contempt. He collapses. Every time Walter dismisses him, belittles him, calls him a junkie or an idiot, Jesse doesn't fight back. He just absorbs it. He believes it. Because Jesse doesn't just want Walter's approval, he needs it. And that need is so powerful it overrides every rational signal telling him to leave. You know someone like this, the friend who stays in a terrible relationship because their partner occasionally says something nice. The colleague who works themselves into the ground for a boss who barely acknowledges them, but once said good job in a meeting and they've been chasing that high ever since. High agreeableness combined with low self-worth creates a person who will tolerate almost anything in exchange for moments of validation. Neuroticism, very high. And here is the accelerant. Neuroticism measures emotional reactivity, anxiety, stress sensitivity, and the tendency to experience negative emotions intensely and frequently. Very high scorers live in a state of near constant emotional turbulence. Small setbacks feel catastrophic. Guilt becomes consuming. Stress triggers don't create discomfort, they trigger spirals. Jesse is off the charts here. His guilt responses alone are clinically remarkable. After Gail's death, he can't sleep, he can't eat, he fills his house with strangers and noise in a desperate attempt to drown out his own internal experience. After Todd kills the boy on the dirt bike, Jesse is psychologically broken in a way that no one around him can even perceive, let alone address. And his coping mechanism? Substance use. Always substance use. Jesse self-medicates with methamphetamine, heroin, marijuana, whatever's available, because his emotional pain is so overwhelming that chemical numbing is the only relief he can access. This is very high neuroticism doing exactly what it does. The emotional volume is turned up so loud that normal coping mechanisms can't handle the signal. And so, you reach for the only thing that turns it down, even if it's destroying you in the process. Combined with high agreeableness and high openness, Jesse's neuroticism creates a perfect storm. He feels everything deeply. He cares about everyone's well-being. His emotional system processes all of it at maximum intensity. He has no filters, no buffers, no capacity to compartmentalize. Walter White, by contrast, can compartmentalize with surgical precision, which is exactly why their dynamic works the way it does, and why it is so destructive. Right, now we get to the part that ties everything together, attachment theory. Quick refresher for anyone new to the channel, attachment theory, originally developed by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth, argues that the emotional bonds we form with our primary caregivers in childhood create internal templates, like a working model, for how we expect relationships to function for the rest of our lives. If your caregivers were consistently warm and responsive, you develop secure attachment, you trust people, you're comfortable with intimacy, you can handle conflict without falling apart. If your caregivers were inconsistent, sometimes present, sometimes withdrawn, approval conditional on performance, you develop anxious attachment. You crave closeness, but never trust that it's real. You're hypervigilant to signs of rejection. You seek reassurance constantly because you learned that love is unreliable and you need to work to keep it. If your caregivers were emotionally unavailable or dismissive, you develop avoidant attachment. You learn to suppress your needs, keep people at an arm's length, and tell yourself you don't really need anyone. And if your caregivers were frightening or deeply unpredictable, sometimes the source of comfort, sometimes the source of danger, you develop disorganized attachment. You simultaneously crave and fear closeness. Your behavior in relationships is contradictory, oscillating between desperate, clinging, and hostile withdrawal. Jesse Pinkman is anxious, preoccupied attachment, tending towards disorganized, and it starts exactly where you'd expect, with his parents. Jesse's parents are not overtly abusive in the way television usually depicts bad parents. They don't hit him, they don't scream. They're somehow something worse than that in some ways. They're conditionally present. The Pinkmans are a respectable middle-class family who have decided that Jesse is a problem. And they have communicated that to him with devastating clarity. When Jesse needs a place to stay, they set conditions he can't meet. When he fails, and he always fails because their conditions are designed for the son they wish they had, not the one they've got, they withdraw. Not with rage, with disappointment. And disappointment, delivered consistently by the people whose love you need most, is one of the most psychologically corrosive experiences a child can have. Because rage, you can externalize. You can get angry back. Disappointment, you internalize. You absorb it as evidence about who you are. Jesse's parents look at him and see failure. And Jesse looks at himself and sees exactly the same thing. Not because he's incapable, but because the only mirror he's ever been given reflects worthlessness back at him. Meanwhile, his younger brother Jake is the golden child, musical, academic, everything Jesse isn't. Or more precisely, everything Jesse stopped being when the family system assigned him the role of the problem child. This dynamic is textbook. One child absorbs the family's dysfunction so the other can be held up as proof that the family is fine. This is where Jesse's anxious attachment takes root. Love in the Pinkman household is conditional. It's available, but only if you perform correctly, and Jesse can never perform correctly enough, which means he spends his entire life in a state of reaching for approval he can't quite grasp. Walter White as attachment figure. And then there is Walter White. And if you understand attachment, what happens next is almost inevitable. Walter is a high school chemistry teacher, a figure of authority, an older man, and critically, Walter occasionally shows Jesse approval. Not consistently, but inconsistently. Unpredictably. Sometimes Walter praises him, sometimes Walter degrades him, sometimes Walter protects him, sometimes Walter endangers him.
I cook. But from what I can tell, you are just a drug addict. You are a pathetic junkie.
The intermittent reinforcement pattern is attachment theory's worst nightmare, because it doesn't extinguish the attachment bond, it strengthens it. Consistent cruelty would eventually drive Jesse away. Consistent kindness would allow him to relax. But the alternation between warmth and contempt keeps Jesse in a permanent state of anxious hypervigilance, always trying to figure out which Walter he's going to get, always adjusting his behavior to try to secure the good version. It is, in psychological terms, almost identical to what a slot machine does to a gambling addict. The unpredictable reward schedule creates a compulsion loop that's nearly impossible to break through with willpower alone. And Jesse can't break it. He stays. Through the lies, through the manipulation, through Jane. And we need to talk about Jane. Jesse stays. Because leaving Walter would mean accepting that yet another person who was supposed to care about him doesn't. And Jesse's psyche cannot absorb that truth. Not yet. Not until the very end. Jane Margalis is the closest Jesse gets to something approaching secure attachment, which makes what happens all the more devastating. Jane sees Jesse, not Captain Cook. Jesse. Not the bravado Jesse, the actual person underneath. She's an artist, she's sharp, she's emotionally direct in a way that Jesse has never experienced from someone he's romantically involved with. And for a brief window, Jesse begins to relax. He starts to believe that maybe, just maybe, he doesn't have to perform to be loved. But Jane has her own psychological architecture, her own recovery, her own vulnerabilities, and when Jesse introduces drugs back into her world, the relationship becomes codependent. They don't save each other, they accelerate each other's descent. And when Walter lets her die, that's not an exaggeration. It's not interpretation. He watches her choke and makes the decision not to intervene.
I was there. And I watched her die. I watched her overdose and choke to death.
Jesse doesn't know this for years. Jesse doesn't know. He carries Jane's death as his own failure, his own guilt, his own evidence that everyone he loved gets destroyed because of him. This is where Jesse's attachment begins trending towards disorganized. Because the person he's bonded to most strongly, Walter, is now secretly the person responsible for his greatest loss.
Sorry about Jane.
I killed her. It was me. I got her back.
Jesse.
Jesse's attachment system is trying to navigate a relationship where the source of comfort is also the source of danger, and it can't resolve that contradiction. So his behavior becomes increasingly erratic. The drug use escalates, the emotional regulation collapses, the suicidal ideation creeps in. Jesse's relationship with Andrea and Brock deserves attention because it reveals what Jesse's attachment looks like when it's oriented downward, towards people he's trying to protect rather than people he's seeking approval from. Jesse is fiercely protective of children. It's one of his most consistent character traits, and it connects to his own experience of being a child who wasn't adequately protected. He's doing for Brock what no one did for him, showing up, being present, being safe. But even here, Jesse's attachment wounds sabotage him. He pulls away from Andrea because he believes he's toxic, that his presence in their lives will poison them the way it poisons everything. It's not that he stops caring, it's that he's so convinced of his own destructiveness that he removes himself as a preemptive measure. This is anxious attachment in its most painful expression. Not the clinging, desperate version. The version where you love someone so much that you leave them because you believe you're the worst thing that could happen to them. One more attachment relationship worth noting, Mike Ehrmantraut is the closest thing Jesse gets to a functional mentor figure, and it is telling that their relationship works precisely because Mike's expectations are clear, consistent, and achievable. Mike doesn't praise Jesse lavishly, he doesn't tell Jesse he's special, he says things like, "You're not as dumb as I thought," and Jesse blooms under it, because for Jesse, consistency is more valuable than warmth. He's so accustomed to unpredictable emotional landscapes that someone who simply shows up reliably and speaks honestly feels like a revelation. Mike's death, at Walter's hands, again, is another attachment severance that Jesse has to absorb. And each one makes the next relationship harder, because Jesse's internal model is accumulating evidence. Everyone you attach to either leaves or dies, and it's probably your fault. So let's pull it together. Why does Jesse Pinkman behave the way he does? The personality structure gives us the mechanism. High openness means he feels everything. High agreeableness means he prioritizes everyone else's needs. Very high neuroticism means his emotional system processes all of this at overwhelming intensity. Low conscientiousness means he cannot build a stable structure to contain any of it. And his moderate, performative extroversion means the face he shows the world is a mask that costs him energy to maintain. The attachment wounds give us the motivation. Jesse learned in childhood that love is conditional, that he is fundamentally disappointing, and that approval must be earned through performance that he can never sustain. So he enters every significant relationship already believing he's going to fail, already primed to accept mistreatment as confirmation of what he already knows about himself. And Walter White exploits this with breathtaking precision. Not necessarily always consciously. Walter's narcissism means he often doesn't recognize what he's doing, but effectively. Every time Jesse gets close to leaving, Walter deploys the one weapon Jesse has no defense against: a moment of paternal approval. You're loyal, and that's what I need. We're partners. I watched Jane die. Even the confession weaponized. Jesse's arc across Breaking Bad is not a journey from innocence to experience. He was never innocent. He was cooking meth before Walter showed up. What Jesse's arc actually represents is the slow, excruciating collapse of a person whose psychological immune system was already compromised, being subjected to repeated traumas by someone who has identified exactly where the vulnerabilities are. And here's the part that breaks my heart about Jesse Pinkman. He knows. At some level, he knows. He knows Walter is using him. He knows the drugs are killing him. He knows that staying in the world is destroying him. He knows that staying in this world is destroying everything he touches. But knowing is not the same as being able to act on what you know. Not when your attachment system is screaming at you that leaving means being completely, finally, irrevocably alone. Because that is the terror at the center of anxious attachment, not pain. Jesse can handle pain, not danger. Jesse walks towards danger constantly. The terror is abandonment. The terror is being confirmed as the worthless person your parents' eyes told you were. And as long as Walter White is willing to occasionally look at Jesse with something resembling paternal pride, Jesse will endure almost anything to stay in that relationship. It's not weakness, it's not stupidity, it's a survival strategy that made perfect sense when Jesse was a child trying to navigate conditional love, and has now become a prison he can't escape as an adult. El Camino, the film that follows Jesse after Breaking Bad's finale, is essentially a story about what happens when that prison door finally opens. Jesse is free, Walter is dead, the partnership is over, and Jesse has to figure out who he is when he's not orbiting someone else's gravitational field. The film is deliberately quieter than the series, less explosive, more internal, because that's what early recovery from an attachment wound looks like. It's not dramatic. It's disorienting. It's sitting in a room and realizing that no one is going to tell you what to do. And that freedom is more frightening than captivity ever was. So what do we do with this? Why does understanding Jesse Pinkman's psychology matter outside of a television show? Because you probably know a Jesse, and I'd almost guarantee it. You know someone who's bright, capable, genuinely kind, and who consistently ends up in relationships or situations that diminishes them. Someone who tolerates being treated badly by a boss, a partner, a friend, because the occasional scrap of approval feels like water in a desert. Someone whose self-talk is so relentlessly negative that when you compliment them, they physically deflect it. Oh, it was nothing. Anyone could have done it. I just got lucky. That's not modesty. That's a person whose internal model of themselves was written by people who didn't see their value, and they've been living inside that script ever since. And here's the difficult part. You can't rescue them the way you want to. You can't just say, you deserve better, and watch them transform, because they don't believe you. Their attachment system has a filing cabinet full of evidence that they're not worth much, and your one kind statement doesn't outweigh 20 years of conditional love. What you can do, and this is genuinely backed by research on earned secure attachment, is be consistent. Not grand, not dramatic, just consistent. Show up when you say you will. Say what you mean. Don't withdraw affection as punishment. Don't make your approval conditional on performance. Because what people like Jesse need isn't someone who tells them they're amazing, it's someone who treats them as if they're worth showing up for, reliably, without conditions, until the new evidence starts to outweigh the old. It takes time. It's not cinematic, but it is real. And if you're watching this and thinking, hang on, this sounds a bit like me, if you're the one who stays too long, tolerates too much, and believes at some fundamental level that you're not quite enough, then I want you to hear something clearly. That belief is not a fact about you. It's a story that was written about you by people who didn't have the capacity to see you properly. And stories can be rewritten. Not easily, not quickly, but they can be rewritten. Jesse Pinkman is not the good guy of Breaking Bad. He's not the bad guy either. He's something more interesting and more human than both of those categories allow for. He's a person whose psychological wounds made him perfectly exploitable by someone who knew exactly how to use them. His high openness made him feel everything. His high agreeableness made him put everyone else first. His neuroticism turned every failure and every loss into a catastrophe he couldn't outrun. And his anxious attachment meant that the one person who could give him what he needed most, consistent parental approval, was also the person most willing to destroy him to get what he wanted. Jesse's story isn't a tragedy of a good person in a bad world, it's a tragedy of a wounded person in a world that rewards the kind of emotional armor Jesse was never given. And if that doesn't make you think about who in your life might be operating with the same invisible wounds, well, you might want to look a little more carefully. That's Jesse Pinkman, frankly human. Now, I want to hear from you. Who should I do next? Drop a character in the comments, tell me why they fascinate you, and if enough of you shout loud enough, they'll end up on the channel. I'll see you in the next one.